Hello, and welcome back to Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and today I wanted to go over a game from the Gibraltar Masters tournament that I believe is wrapping up at the time of filming. This is a game between two very strong players. Those players are Shakhriyar Mamedyarov and Anna Muzychuk. Of course, Anna Muzychuk's sister is actually going to be playing in the Cairns Cup. Anna herself, I believe, is tied up in Gibraltar, as we'll see from this game. This is actually a very interesting game. It shows the depth of opening prep that these players actually go to, and the advantages when one player actually gets a little bit caught. So let's see what happens. Shak started with knight f3, Anna responded with c5, c4, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. Both players developing, very important. We see e3, and this is where the symmetry was broken. Black can respond with e6 if she so desired. Instead, she played e5, taking a more aggressive approach to controlling the center. Unfortunately, since white gets to move first, black cannot adequately control d4 enough to prevent white from playing it, so white plays d4 anyways. And the main line here goes c takes d4, e takes d4, followed by e4. What Anna decided to do was very, very similar. She just played e4 immediately. The response to this is knight e5 for Shak. Anna simply develops with g6, keeping this tension in the center for a little bit longer. And here, Shak plays a move that is surprising to my eyes, but actually, he's played it before. So hopefully it wasn't too surprising to Anna. Of course, these players go very, very deep, examine a lot of their opponent's games for each round here. And this move is g4. And this move's pretty interesting. Sometimes when you play g4, it's to launch a devastating attack on the king side. Sometimes when you play g4, it's to prevent a very simple move, like something like f5 later on. In this case, Shak plays g4, and I don't think the idea for Shak was actually to try and break through on the king side right away. I think he just wanted some extra space. And this is an idea we're seeing a lot more often these days at the top level. Players are not really shying away from playing these traditionally weakening moves like g4 just to get this extra space, just to make their opponent feel a little bit more cramped. And I think that's why Shak played it here. Anna responds with h6, preventing any g5 ideas. Shak simply plays bishop g2. We see bishop g7. Now Shak simply plays h3. He defends his pawn on g4. He takes the time out of his day to make sure everything stays solid. And he's just ready to continue now with development. He's just going to leave this pawn on g4 for the foreseeable future. And here is where we actually deviate from Shak's previous games. Historically, this was played against Shak in a game from 2018 where he had the white pieces against actually Maxime Vishirlagrov. And queen e7 I think is the best move. That game continued with b3, and in the game, MVL played c takes d4, e takes d4, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and queen takes e5. And here Shak gambited a pawn in exchange for some open lines and some pressure against this black center. And now you really see how the white pawns have been positioned such that this pawn on e4 is going to be a little bit loose, a little bit isolated. And I think this was actually a pretty good way of playing for MVL, despite the fact that he did go on to lose that game. The move that Anna played is actually a lot more combative, but I think it simply gives white an edge. She tried d5, immediately breaking in the center, trying to break down all of these white pawns. But then we saw something similar to the game with MVL happen, but there were some key differences, which we're going to examine. Here, Shak actually just captures on d5. We see knight takes d5, and now knight takes e4 is the point. And now it's actually black who has gambited a pawn already early on. We see c takes d4, e takes d4, castles and castles. And now the difference here, I think, is if you look at the MVL game, MVL got rid of this d4 pawn and was left with this e4 pawn. And white still had a little bit of an edge, despite the fact that he was down this pawn. The difference in this case is white has this edge in activity, and also he's the one who's up the pawn. So Anna is going to be scrambling to try and regain this pawn while in the meantime, Shak can focus solely on activating his pieces, not having to worry about returning a gambited pawn. And in the game, Anna actually made another mistake here. I think the best move would have been something like queen b6, really eyeing this d4 pawn, immediately trying to regain it. And this asks White some awkward questions. In fact, Shak is going to have to make some kind of concession here. Option number one to deal with this weakness is to play bishop e3, but this is actually just a terrible move. Black will capture and capture. He gets all of the pawns. So you can't defend this pawn. Bishop e3 is like the only way to really defend this pawn, unless you want to play like knight f3, which unveils the bishop, or one of his real options, which is knight c5. But knight c5 is in fact a concession, because now after knight takes e5, you can't really recapture. So you'll see bishop takes d5, and after knight c6, you're attacking this pawn, so white can now defend it. But after something like rook d8 or queen d8, black is in fact going to be regaining this pawn in the center. So knight c5 doesn't really keep the d pawn. So your only option to maintain the extra pawn is to take this knight on c6, but this change in structure is actually pretty favorable for black. This knight on d5 is a lot more solid, and you're going to have permanent lasting pressure against this d4 pawn. And while white should have an edge here, thanks to the extra material, black would have had a pretty reasonable game. Instead though, Anna didn't play quite so quickly for pressure against d4, instead playing rook e8, trying to take off this knight. But now, in fact, Shak finds some very clever tactics. He plays rook e1 here. And now, after knight takes e5, which was the idea, we simply see d takes e5. Anna recaptures this pawn with rook takes e5. But now we actually see that the black pieces are coordinated a little bit awkwardly. There's just some very, very annoying threats to deal with in the position that you wouldn't necessarily expect. In the game, Shak played bishop e3, which is a very good move, but in fact it's not the best move. The best move is actually bishop f4, taking advantage of this pin to the black queen, and then the very, very natural rook e8 actually fails to some very, very fun tactics that I'd like to show you guys. So what happens if you want to pause the video here to try and find the winning tactic for white? Go ahead now, it's a fun one. Of course, the winning move, everybody sees it, queen takes d5. And now, if black recaptures this piece, we're simply going to play knight f6 check, and after bishop takes f6, do we take the queen? We could, but no, first we take this extra rook and take on d5. And of course, black doesn't have to fall for this tactic all the way, but it does highlight how the black pieces are just coordinated a little bit too awkwardly. So after bishop f4, black would have to play something like rook e7, and now queen d2 would be a nice move, just to highlight that this pawn is going to be very, very weak. You can play something like g5, but you're running into some very annoying tactics like bishop d6. Difficult stuff for black, to be sure. Instead though, we saw bishop e3, and here perhaps Anna should have tried to develop this bishop a little bit, allow a move like bishop d4, and simply sacrifice this exchange, in exchange for the bishop pair and some threats to the king's side. Instead of that though, we actually see rook e8 from Anna. Now this tactic doesn't quite work because this bishop's in the way, which is why bishop f4 might have been a little bit more accurate. Instead though, Shak finds another very nice tactic, and that tactic is bishop takes h6, with the same, or a very similar idea. You want to distract this bishop from the f6 square, and then capture on d5. And this is what we see in the game. Black doesn't have to fall for this, of course, so Anna instead plays bishop e6, but now the damage has been done, and Shak is simply going to be up a clean a pawn in this position. So rook takes b2, Shak activates all of his pieces with rook d1, the queen comes out to h4, and now what do you do with an extra pawn? You make use of it. Passed pawns must be pushed. So we see a4, a5, a6, Shak wastes no time, and in fact, it's two extra pawns, I should state, with the h pawn missing for black as well. Rook e7 is Anna's choice. Not the most astute defense, but it's a losing position anyways. Queen c5 is Shak's response, giving this pawn back, but in exchange, we see some devastating threats land around this black king. Knight g5 actually interferes with the queen and makes a threat to the rook. Let's see. Rook a2 was Anna's response to this. Of course, now taking would be a mistake due to checkmate. Instead, though, simply rook f1, renewing the threat to the rook. King g7, defending. Now queen e5 check. King comes back to g8, and queen f6. And this is where Anna actually decided to resign. There's simply too many threats around this black king. Black can't handle it. Once again, this rook is attacked. The only way to really deal with it is to play rook a7. But now we simply have takes, takes, knight takes, and the queen will fall. And this is why black threw in the towel here. Nothing to be done. A very impressive game, actually, from Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, proving once again why he has maintained his position clearly above 2,700 and usually in the top 10. Shak, a world-class player, showing how opening prep can get it done. Thank you very much for joining me in this week's episode of Game Review, and I will see you in the next episode.